Okay. Welcome, everyone. Great to see you and to welcome you to our program, especially those who have their video screens on. Nice to see your faces, your smiles. For those whose videos are off, I'm just imagining your faces and smiles. There you go. You're welcome if you can. If you can, to turn on your video, it would be nice to see you so we could kind of like even deepen the level of connection. So thank you and welcome all of you to Beth Jacobs Modern Minds Conversations. I wanted to express our deep gratitude to Heidi and Albert Prua for sponsoring and help driving the vision of our Modern Minds series. And Albert, great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us and being such a leader in the shul. It's really a privilege to welcome back to Beth Jacob, Rabbi Dov Lipman, who's been a guest in person. Remember those days? Who's been a guest in person of Beth Jacob in the past. Rabbi Dov Lipman served in the 19th Knesset as part of the Yesh Atid party, and he chaired the Knesset task force for the integration of Haredim into Israeli society. Rabbi Lipman, many of you have been following his writings. He's the author of 8 books. You've kind of heard about him, and you've maybe heard him at Beth Jacob, so you kind of know about him. He's a unique individual who has dedicated many years to building bridges. He's originally born and raised in the United States, in Silver Spring, Maryland, earned a master's degree in education from Johns Hopkins, a smicha from Ner Yisrael, and then fulfilling the dream of making Aliyah with his family around 15, 16 years ago, and really becoming a force in Israel. And he's dedicated many years to building bridges. Not the Brooklyn Bridge or other those kinds of bridges, but between religious Jew and secular Jew, between the American Jewish community in Israel, and also between Haredim, between the Haredi community and Israeli society, working to bring the Haredi community into the workforce and into the army, and this has been a big issue also in terms of the pandemic, with the Haredim, many of whom protesting some of the rules and some of the treatment of the government. So there's been a lot of tension recently in Israel that perhaps Rabbi Lipman will speak to in society with regards to the Haredim and the rest of society. So that's going to be his focus tonight. But we look forward to hearing from Rabbi Lipman about the Haredi revolution and their integration into Israeli society and anything else he wants to speak about in terms of the Matzav in Israel. Rabbi Lipman is joining us live, which makes this very special. He's live from Beit Shemesh, which is around 6:35 in the morning. So thank you, Rabbi Lipman, for waking up early and arranging your Shachar schedule to fit our community. And we're really honored and appreciative that you're able to join us this evening. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Lipman. You're welcome to send in questions or comments to the chat box. There will be a time towards the end of the program that Rabbi Posey will moderate a question and answer session to take your questions and pose them to Rabbi Lipman to hopefully address some or many of the questions that you ask. Rabbi Lipman, thank you so much, and turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Trop. I really appreciate you welcoming me back to the shul. I remember my Shabbat in Los Angeles and spending time speaking with you, I think on stage inside your shul. I must tell everyone it was certainly easier to speak when you have a room of people that you can look at. I am not going to pressure anyone to turn on their videos because I'm guilty of sitting on far too many Zooms with the camera off so I can be comfortable in my home. But those of you who feel that you can turn on the cameras, it's certainly easier to look at faces as I'm speaking and being able to also engage in conversation with you. I also understand for sure this has probably been such a hard time for the shul, and I'm happy that I can see everyone who's here with us healthy and engaged, and we all certainly look forward to much better times ahead. The mood in Israel, I'll just tell you before we get to our topic, is somewhat mixed. On the one hand, there's a real feeling of excitement and hope as everyone around us becomes vaccinated. But at the same time, the numbers are not going down, and there's certainly a feeling that the mutations are here and much more difficult than the previous waves. So we'll have to see where everything goes. But I know that all of us share a desire just to get back to normal life, and Bezrat Hashem, with God's help, we'll be blessed to experience that soon. The topic that we have tonight actually hits on, as the rabbi said, to the issue of corona. I don't have a doubt that all of you have seen significant negative media about the Haredi community in Israel, the ultra-Orthodox population. You've no doubt seen mass weddings and videos of mass funerals. You've seen video of schools being open, even though in Israel for the last few weeks, the law has mandated that schools have to be closed. You've probably seen videos of Haredim demonstrating in the streets of Israel against draft to the army, and really horrible pictures of the police clashing with the ultra-Orthodox population. And that, without a doubt, has painted a very negative picture in your minds regarding what is happening in the Haredi world in Israel, and also perhaps just makes you feel negative in general against this population. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to go through what is really happening around, and hopefully as we go through that, you'll walk away with a positive, perhaps even optimistic feeling about Israel's future. And we know that there's a direct correlation between the status of the Haredi community in Israel and all of the issues of religion and state in Israel. Remember, in Israel, as opposed to the United States, we don't have separation of church and state. We want to be a Jewish state, and that leads to significant tensions and questions about policy in Israel. So, for example, the rules of marriage in Israel, how you're allowed to get married, and that's governed by the Rabbanut, which is very much run by the Haredi Rabbanim. What are the rules about Shabbat in Israel? What are the rules about burial in Israel? Anything related to religious life cycle events, that is very much mandated by the rabbinate, which is controlled by the ultra-Orthodox population and the Rabbanim, and that leads to a lot of tension in Israel, as you have a broader population that's not necessarily in line with the Haredi community regarding the way it lives its life, and then we have a question about what the policies should be. At the end, I'm going to come back to that, but for now, let's dive in and understand exactly what the story is with the ultra-Orthodox population in Israel. In order to do that, I always feel to understand where a population is coming from, you have to see it somewhat from their perspective as well, in terms of the history and what has happened in Israel. So a lot of you might not know this, but the first group to really settle, if I could call it modern Israel, over the last few centuries, is actually students of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, and the students of the Vilna Gaon, who was the head of Lithuanian Jewry in the late 18th century. Their students were sent to Israel to be emissaries of the Jewish people. They did not come here to create a state. They did not come here to create an agricultural society. They came here to study Torah and live spiritual lives. They were actually supported by World Jewry in a program that was called the Chalukah. European Jewry primarily sent money here in order to sustain this population. They started out in the north, mostly in the Tzfat and Tiberia area, and then eventually made their way also towards Yerushalayim, towards Jerusalem. And they lived this life for decades, very quietly, feeling that they were the spiritual emissaries of all of the Jewish people around the world. And then Zionism, the Zionist movement, begins in the 19th century, the late 19th century, primarily driven by very secular Jews in their religious orientation. And these very spiritual, ultra-Orthodox Jews all of a sudden see the land where they're living being inundated with secular Jews who, and I'm going to be very cautious about how I speak about them because I have reverence for them for being the ones to found the state of Israel. But we have to be very, very open and honest. The founders of the state of Israel, the secular founders, were extremely, extremely secular in nature. They wanted to create a new Judaism in Israel, which was devoid of Torah, devoid of mitzvah observance, and even devoid of God. I'll come back to that in a moment. And all of a sudden, you have this massive clash between Jews in Israel. I'm talking now the beginning of the 20th century. where they cannot believe what they're seeing as Jews are moving here and not observant at all, and moving here en masse as tens of thousands come in the first Aliyah, the second Aliyah. And in 1913, an amazing event takes place. Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, who was the rabbi of the ultra-Orthodox population in Yerushalayim, goes on a tour, almost a pilgrimage, together with Rav Kook, who was the chief rabbi of what was called Palestine at the time. And their idea was, let's go around to all the secular kibbutzim in Israel and really get a sense for what's going on here. And they saw things which shocked them. They saw kibbutzim where people were eating pork. They saw kibbutzim where people were not keeping anything regarding Yom Kippur, and certainly no Shabbat observance, no kashrut. And the two of them had very different reactions to this journey. Rav Sonnenfeld said, we can have nothing to do with this population. It's time to circle the wagons, and we will be completely disconnected from this developing state of Israel. And that essentially established the Haredi model of Israel, where there's an isolated, very insulated community. Rav Kook had a very different perspective, and he said, yeah, it's bad out there, but there's one kibbutz where we convinced them to start a shul, to have a Beit Knesset. There's another shul, another community where we convinced them to fast on Yom Kippur. There's hope. If we stay engaged with this community and show them love and act with unity, then we can influence this developing state. That essentially built the model for the religious Zionist community in Israel. And we have these two different camps in terms of how they're going to approach the state of Israel and the founding of the state of Israel. Let's fast forward now to the founding of the state, 1948 to 1950. Ben Gurion has to make a decision. What am I going to do with this ultra-Orthodox population, which is not very much part of the state? They don't want to be part of the army. They don't want to be part of the government necessarily. He meets with the Chazon Ish. Ben Gurion goes to Bnei Brak. There's a pretty famous picture of him going into the Chazon Ish's apartment building, and he engages in conversation with the Chazon Ish, the leader of the Haredi community in Israel. And they come to an agreement together. What is that agreement? Ben Gurion agrees that 400 elite scholars, the really strong yeshiva boys, they do not have to serve in the army. They're going to be exempt. They're going to be studying Torah. 400. That was the deal that was made back then. And that essentially established the idea that there would be yeshiva boys who are dedicated towards learning Torah, and at the ages of 18, 19, 20, which are critical for them in terms of their Torah development, they don't have to go to the army. Let's fast forward now, 70 years later. That 400 young men who were exempt from serving in the army is now 60,000 plus. 60,000 plus 18, 19, 20-year-olds who get a blanket exemption not to serve in the army. That's very different than when we had a small country at just 400. Now it's a massive population which is being exempt from serving in the army. As you can imagine, that creates significant tension in Israel as the rest of Israel says, wait a minute, my children have to go and fight in the army and put their lives on the line. And an entire population, just because they're associated with and identify themselves as Haredim, they don't have to serve in the army. That's one massive change that has taken place in the 70 years and is the source of significant tension in Israel. But along with that, there's another change that has taken place in Israel over the 70 years. It's almost as if you can see Rav Kook's vision coming true before our eyes. Because today in Israel, I'll go back to 1948 for a moment. When the Declaration of Independence was written, there was a controversy about whether they should put the word God in Israel's Declaration of Independence. Imagine that. The Jewish state, after 2,000 years, we come back to our biblical or ancestral homeland, and a significant part of the population did not want God to be mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. The religious side wanted it, and they came to a compromise. And it says, Tzur Yisrael, the Rock of Israel. The religious side can say that means God. The secular side can say that means the army or the wisdom of the Jewish people. In today's day and age, 2021, there is no doubt that if we were writing the Declaration of Independence in Israel, it would say God. People talk about God all over the streets of Israel. You hear the prime minister, the president, the defense minister, when they speak, they'll use the words Baruch Hashem, thank God. We have religious people in significant positions, but not just the religious population. Amongst the quote unquote secular population of Israel, there is a renaissance that's going on in terms of an interest in Judaism and an interest in spirituality. I can tell you on Shavuot night in Israel, I've had the great honor of speaking throughout the night in a movie theater filled with hundreds of quote unquote secular Jews who come to learn Torah on Shavuot night. Throughout Israel, there are all kinds of alternative Kabbalat Shabbat services. People want to connect. The numbers are 90% plus that fast on Yom Kippur, light Hanukkah candles. I'll tell you an amazing story that happened when I first got involved with the Yesh Atid party, which is a primarily secular party in Israel, led by a secular leader named Yair Lapid. And they had a night of all the candidates. This is during the elections in 2013, the candidates getting together and getting to know one another. And we had played all kinds of games and questions and answers. And then at the end of the night, a really prominent Israeli singer walks into the house. And this is in Yair Lapid's house. And he says, everybody gather up in a circle. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my, what's about to happen here? And he gets into the middle of the circle, and we stand there as candidates in a circle. And he starts singing Adon Olam, the tefillah that we say every single Shabbat, and we say it every morning in Shacharit. And we, as candidates of this primarily secular party in Israel, sang Adon Olam together. It was this moment that I'll never forget. It really captures this idea that we are not the secular Israel that we were 70 years ago, but we're in a very, very different place. This really hit home for me when I went to the gym one night to work out many years ago. And I usually just put on the television screen some kind of a sports game just to kind of distract myself while I'm exercising. And all that was on was a soccer match between Israeli national team and the national team in England. And right before the match begins, and there are millions of people watching this around Europe and in Israel, they zoom in on the superstar of the team from the UK, and then they zoom in on the superstar Eran Zahavi from Israel. Secular Jew in Israel, Eran Zahavi, he plays on a team in China throughout the year, but here he is representing Israel. And right before it begins, millions of people saw this guy without a kippah on his head go like this. Just like that. He says Shema publicly for the whole world to see as this match begins. That's quote unquote secular Israel. Secular Israel is in a very different place than it was in 1948. So think about what we have happening here. On the one hand, we have a Haredi community, which seems to be just growing in terms of the numbers who are not involved in what's happening in Israel, not involved in general studies, working, serving in the army. And you have secular Israel, which is becoming more spiritual and connected religiously. And here I am to share with you the incredible, incredible changes that are actually happening on the ground in the Haredi community in Israel as well. I was blessed to be elected to the Knesset in 2013. And one of the greatest honors that I had was to head a task force about the integration of the Haredim into Israeli society. And I discovered, as I went through this process, two things. First, I discovered the unbearable, and I use that word very deliberately, the unbearable poverty that exists in the Haredi community. Think about it for a moment. You're talking about families that, thank God, are having large numbers of children. The average number of children is about 7 to 8 children per family. But there's an ideology which says that the father, and I'm mentioning the father very specifically, doesn't get a general education and doesn't go to work. So how is this family sustaining itself? The women do go to work and they do get an education, but they can't do enough to sustain an entire family while also being a mother to so many children. And the poverty is unbearable. I'm talking about people who literally don't have food at times to serve to their children. And as I started seeing that, I figured to myself, why do we have to take on the issue of army, which is a big ideological issue for them? Let's first address the issue of work. Let's see if we can help Haredim get to work. And I helped to found a project that's called Avodot LaCharedim. It's within the Haredi community. There's basically a Haredi employment agency, which takes no money from the people who are looking for work and no money from the companies that are looking to hire. And we match Haredim. We have promotions all over the Haredi community. If you want to support your family with dignity, come and reach out to us. We'll help you find a job. I can fast forward now, 7-8 years into that project. We've been blessed to help 80,000 Haredim get training and support their families with dignity. And it's an absolute street level revolution that's taking place, because once one young man finds a job, he tells his friend who tells his friend, and we are getting tens of thousands of requests per month of Haredim who are looking to try to find jobs. And it's amazing. I had one Belzer Chassid who I helped to find a job, and he came to me to give me a thank you. He came to me in the Knesset, actually. His wife made this gift basket for me to say thank you for helping a job. By the way, by the Knesset rules, I had to give the gift basket into the ethics committee because you're not allowed to accept any kind of gifts from anyone. And he says to me, an amazing thing happened. I said, what? He said, I went to work for a month, and after the month, this huge amount of money was put into my bank account. And it was like this light bulb went off in his head, where he realized the connection between a month of work and having money to buy his children food and clothing and pay his bills. And I saw the satisfaction that he felt over the fact that he just worked, and now he's providing for his family instead of him going to the government for some kind of a handout or going to America to knock on people's doors. He himself is earning for his family. I saw the pride on his face, and I have no doubt that he told his friends, and this is how that revolution is working. An amazing thing happens when Haredim go to work. A barrier breaks down between Haredi Israel and broader and secular Israel. It just happens before our eyes. Just to give you two stories to indicate that. So I work really hard with CEOs to try to get them to hire Haredim. It's not easy. They have a lot of negative bias and negative perspectives against the Haredi community. And I have to sit and really explain to them why it's worthwhile to hire them. And one CEO who was very reluctant to hire any Haredim called me a few months into the project, and he said, Dov, an amazing thing is happening here. He said one chassid from Beitar, which is a Haredi community, had a bar mitzvah for his son, and he invited everyone in his division in the company to come to the bar mitzvah, including secular workers. He said nothing about how they should dress. He didn't make any demands, just come. That, my friends, is a revolution in the Haredi community, that someone is comfortable to invite Chilonim, secular Israelis, to come to Beitar to be part of their bar mitzvah. And the reverse happens as well. He said there was a secular worker in a certain division and department who got married, and he invited two Hasidim from his department to be the witnesses at his wedding. I'm not suggesting that we've reached utopia. We have a long way to go in this process, but you're starting to see some of the benefits that come when we get the Haredim to go to work. First and foremost, just that they can support their families. And if I stopped right there, that would be a goal that's worthwhile enough. But you actually start seeing how it starts to mend some of the wounds in Israeli society as Haredim, for the first time, meet secular Israel, and secular Israelis, for the first time, meet Haredim and realize that these are wonderful people who might live a different lifestyle, and we might disagree about some of the issues, but we can actually be friends with one another. So that's on the issue of work, where we're seeing a massive change that's taking place. This shift from living off of the government supporting them to supporting their families themselves, and then by extension, being part of the tax revenue of the state and just being part of Israeli society. That's the first step, getting to work. But we also started addressing the issue of the army. And I realized that we had to do this when in 2014, when Israel went to war in Gaza, I started getting phone calls from young Haredim who would ask to meet with me. And it's fascinating how this works. They don't ask to meet with you in broad daylight. I had to go to a park near Bnei Brak at 1 o'clock in the morning. A little scary to what exactly am I coming into? And you show up there, and there are 40 to 50, 18, 19-year-olds, the payas, the full black hat, the long coat. They're sitting there waiting to meet with me. And they say, member of Knesset Lippman, we really want to serve in the army. It's very hard for us to see in the news that there are young Israelis our age who are on the front lines and we aren't. It really, there's a feeling of guilt that they have inside of themselves. They want to serve the country, but they can't just leave yeshiva and go to the army. And to be honest with you, my own son didn't serve in a regular army unit. He served in something called a Hesder unit, where his entire shir, his class from his yeshiva, went to the army together. So he had a religious framework when he went into the army, because it's very difficult to all of a sudden be sent into an environment which is completely secular. And I spoke with them for a while and realized we have to work to create more units in the army for Haredim. I say more because there already was something called Nachal Haredi, which was a unit which was set up for Haredim, but we had to do more for the Haredi community. And I was blessed to be part of a process which set up Haredi units in almost every single division in the army, both combat and non-combat. In those units, we go out of our way to meet their needs. What are those needs? First of all, we make sure they have prayer services 3 times a day, that they have Torah study every single day. We promise them, and we make sure that there will not be female commanders, even though I'm completely fine with females advancing in the army and being able to accomplish whatever they want to accomplish. If we want to get Haredim into the army, we have to promise them that they won't be put in a position where they will not feel comfortable, and they will have only male commanders, not necessarily religious commanders, but they will have male commanders. And we have projects which combine together Torah learning and serving in the army. We founded the first ever Haredi Hesder Yeshiva. It started with a small group of 10 young men where they, for the first 3 years, they learned Torah in the morning and afternoon, and at nighttime they're trained in computers, in electronics, in engineering. And then the last 2 years of the program, they're still in yeshiva, but every single morning they wake up, they put on an Israeli army uniform. They go serve in the army, in the intelligence unit, in other units that are not combat. And they come back at night to their yeshiva and they have night seder. They learn Torah at night. And from their families' perspectives, they're in yeshiva for 5 years. But along the way, what's happening? They are studying Torah. They are learning a trade. They're serving their country. And we just had the first graduates leave. Every single one of them was hired by a top company in Israel. They're making top level salaries, and they're doing an incredible thing, combining together the best of all worlds. I will tell you, we don't have enough space for the requests to be admitted to that yeshiva. Because now that we're 5 years into it and the Haredi population can see these young men are still religious, they have not been impacted negatively. And just the opposite, they're now supporting their families, and they are B'nai Torah. They learn Torah every single day. They look completely Haredi, and they are Haredi. Just they're not in yeshiva anymore. They're in the workforce. And that's a massive revolution that's taking place as well on an army level. I went to one of those programs to visit, not the Hesder Yeshiva, but one of the combat units. And I asked one of the men, a Haredi guy, Payas, I said to him, how is this hard for you spiritually? And he said to me, it's easier for me spiritually. He said, in the army, in this program, if I don't get up for my morning prayers, I'm thrown out of the program. There's zero tolerance. I'm thrown out of the, it's the army. I'm thrown out if I don't go to Shacharit in the morning. He said, in yeshiva, I could go a good couple of weeks before anybody notices if I actually got up in the morning, sadly. But that's sort of the situation. He said, I'm stronger spiritually because I'm in the army. Think about that. So we have a revolution that's taking place very, very quietly in terms of Haredim entering the army. And then we get to the issue of general education. And that was, I think, the biggest challenge that we've had, because there's a real feeling, which I understand, which says secular Israel, the Israeli government is not going to tell us what we should study in our schools. We have yeshivot, we study Torah, and that's all we do. The problem is with that system is when they get old enough to want to go to work, they don't have the tools that are necessary to get a job. They don't know English. They don't know basic math. They don't know that 4 times 4 is 16. They don't know how to function in the world. We try to catch them up in our programs, but they're really, really set back in terms of their ability to succeed. And I'll just add, by extension, I happen to believe ideologically that studying general studies is part of who we are as Jews. My Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Yaakov Weinberg Zatzal, used to say that God revealed himself to the world twice. Not just this week we're reading on Shabbat, we're going to read about the story of the revelation at Sinai and the giving of the 10 Commandments. That was one revelation. And that's why we study Torah. But God also revealed himself to us when he created the world. Every single part of creation teaches us more and more about God. And we have to learn about that as well. So I don't come to them with that ideology, but it certainly motivates me as I try to work for them to have general studies. But for them, it's more to be able to have the skills to be able to go to work. That's ultimately what it's truly all about. And I want to tell you, I found a partner. His name is Rabbi Menachem Bambach. Some of you might have heard of him. He is the most incredible human being. He's a Vizhnitzer Chassid who grew up in Bnei Brak. And he said one day he woke up, he was married with children. He had no money to pay for their survival. And he also had no tools to be able to get a job. And that motivated him to be self-learned in terms of getting a general education. He went to university. He has a degree. And together, he's really the one to get the credit for it. I've tried to help behind the scenes in terms of raising funds for him. He has opened up a network of yeshivot. I'm going to pause for a moment now, and we'll see if I can succeed in the technology here. But I really do want you to see just a moment. If you could just press play, a moment. We'll see a few moments of this yeshiva. You're going to see about 30 seconds. Watch this. If we get the sound.
תוכל לפגוש כאן תלמידים מכל החסידויות. אם זה תולדות אהרון, ויז'ניץ, מחנופקה, בלז, יש כאן קרלין, פינסקה, הכל.
גור.
אפילו גור.
תסביר לי איך הגעת לפה.
איך הגעתי לפה? אני אסביר לך. הגעתי לפה משמיים, בטוח. רוצה להיות יהודי טוב, ללמוד גמרא, לדעת הלכות, לדעת איך להתנהג כמו יהודי. וחוץ מזה, אני אוהב את הלימודי חול, אני רוצה לדעת אנגלית, מתמטיקה.
אני רציתי גם ללמוד גם לדברים אחרים. לא יכול כל היום רק ללמוד גמרא. וגם על הדרך אתה מקבל כאן תעודת בגרות, אתה יוצא מאוד נחמדה, יש כאן מלא מקצועות.
שב-2028, 40%.
You can fast forward towards the very, very end, just like about a minute towards the end.
עורכי דינים, כי אמורה לזהות, שיהיו אנשים ששומרים על הערכים שלהם, על הנורמות, זה מאוד מאוד חשוב. ומצד שני, אתה רוצה אותם כרופאים, כעורכי דינים, כמהנדסים. אני רוצה לראות אותם משתלבים בשירות הציבורי.
נפתלי, מה אתה רוצה להיות שתהיה גדול?
שאלה הכי קשה. אני רוצה לעסוק בתחומי המדע.
מה בתחומי המדע?
אני לא יודע בדיוק לאיזה כיוון ללכת. אבל זה מושך אותי. בעיקר מושך אותי תחום הכימיה.
היום עוד 10 שנים, מה החלום שלך?
אני אישית? אני די אוהב מחשבים, ואני גם חושב שאני אצא, זה גם פרנסה, וזה גם מקצוע שאני די אוהב, אז לא אכפת להיות איזה איש הייטק. לא אכפת לי, אני רוצה.
מה אני רוצה להיות? אני חשבתי ללכת לעבוד בבנק אולי, לא יודע.
אני רוצה להיות עורך דין.
למה?
You can pause it right there, please.
מעניין אותי לקחת בן אדם שהוא נמצא.
So you can stop the share as well. We're going to go to another video in a moment. But what you just saw is a revolution. It's a revolution. Young Haredim, Hasidim who are saying, I want to work in chemistry. I want to be a banker. I want to work in computers. I want to work in law. And that is what's happening. Rabbi Bambach has set up now 11 different branches of this yeshiva, where they're learning full general studies, combined together being Haredi, learning Torah, and also learning a trade, learning the skills, and to be able to go into higher education one day. We're working very hard that the universities also should be amenable and accept some of the needs that we have for the Haredi community, to have separate classes between the boys and the girls. A lot of people have fought against me on this. I am out there very vocal. If you want them to go to university, you have to understand that they're not going to sit in a university class that is co-ed. And we've already succeeded in establishing those programs on a undergraduate level, and now we're fighting to have it on a graduate level. I want to show you now, though, another part that comes along with that type of yeshiva, and that is a video that shows this school on Yom HaZikaron, on Memorial Day in Israel. This is a real challenge because the Haredi community, on the one hand, officially has not been going to the army. They have not commemorated Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day. And if we could show on the screen for a moment, we're going to show like just the first few minutes, first minute or so. Here we go. This is Yom HaZikaron in that same yeshiva.
אני הולך עכשיו לתת לכם תמונה. אני רוצה שתגידו לי מה התמונה הזאת מעוררת בכם. אוקיי? אני רוצה שתסתכלו טוב, תתבוננו במשך דקה אחת. תסתכלו טוב בתמונה. אני רוצה שתנסו לחשוב מה זה מעורר בכם. האם מישהו רוצה להגיד לי מה התמונה הזאת מעוררת בו באופן אישי? מה הוא מרגיש כשהוא מסתכל בתמונה הזאת? כן, נתי.
אני מרגיש סוג של רחמים על הילד הזה, וגם אני משתתף איתו בצער, וגם סוג של פחד.
תודה. כן.
שהוא מתגעגע מאוד לאביו.
למה הוא מתגעגע לאבא שלו?
בגלל שאין לו אותו עכשיו, אז
סוג של חוסר אונים, הוא לא יודע מה לעשות עם עצמו, פשוט נשכב על הקבר ונרדם.
תנסו לחשוב על ילד שאבא שלו יצא להילחם.
They're reciting prayers right now for soldiers who have passed away.
אני מבקש משיעור ג' לבוא לכאן ולהדליק נר, אוקיי? כן.
Hasidic Haredi boys lighting memorial candles for fallen Israeli soldiers.
שיעור ב'.
You can pause the video. Thank you so much and stop the share. Again, a revolution. There's no other way to describe it. A community which has struggled so much with how to deal with the army and secular holidays, so to speak, holy days and significant commemorations. And now look at what's happening over there. That's part of the revolution that's taking place as well. Everything that you've heard me describe so far, going to work, going to army, and the general studies, that has a direct implication for the religion and state issues in Israel. And why is that? A majority of Israel, overwhelming majority of Israel, believes that there should be changes in terms of how things work in Israel with religion and state. They believe that we should be more moderate, embracing, not demanding on a legislative level in terms of religion in Israel. But why isn't there change? If there's a majority of Israel, it's because of Israel's political system, where we have ultra-Orthodox political parties that have typically been the kingmakers in every coalition. Every prime minister, whether right-wing or left-wing, needs to find 61 members of Knesset to join their coalition. And the Haredi parties will say, do whatever you want on the security front, do whatever you want in terms of overall economic policy, just give us control over the religious issues and we will join your coalition. And that has given them the control over every single issue of religion and state. But what's happening? An amazing, amazing thing. As the Haredi community is growing, you would think the Haredi political power should be growing as well. And it's not. They stay every single election at about 16 seats, even though, like I said before, the rest of Israel is having 3 children per family. They're having 7 children per family. Shouldn't they be taking over the Knesset? They're not. And that is because the younger generation is not falling in line and just voting together with whatever the rabbis tell them to do. And they're thinking for themselves and they're voting for the party that they really feel is the best for whatever issues are important to them in the running of Israel. And as that continues, there will reach a point where politically we'll be able to make changes even when it comes to religion and state, because these younger Haredim are more moderate in nature and they're interested in what's best for broader Israel and not just for what's best for their own communities. And we're seeing that play out in front of our eyes as their numbers aren't growing. And I always had this as a theory. And I always spoke about this as a theory and said, one day, politically, things will change. And then 2 years ago, it played out right before my eyes in Beit Shemesh, in the city where I live. A city which is a majority Haredi, majority ultra-Orthodox. And we had elections for mayor here. And the ultra-Orthodox incumbent was running for mayor. So, of course, he's going to win the election. And a woman met with me, a religious Zionist woman with a PhD named Aliza Bloch. And she says to me, I'm going to run for mayor against the Haredi candidate. And I said, Aliza, listen, I'll support you, but because I'm the big political expert, you have no chance of winning. You have no chance. It's a majority Haredi city. And there we were on election night. I cried. I literally cried as the results were announced, as Dr. Aliza Bloch, a religious Zionist woman with a PhD, became the mayor of Beit Shemesh in a majority Haredi city, as 4,000 Haredim voted for her and 5,000 Haredim didn't vote at all. And that was their way of letting her win. These are the Haredim that are going to work. These are the Haredim that are interested in being part of Israeli society. And that really captures this idea of the change that is slowly, gradually, quietly taking place before our eyes. This is not going to happen overnight. This is going to be a gradual, I think, 2-3 generations. I often say we've started a process that I'm not going to live to see the end of that process. But in the end of that process, we are going to see an Israel that is filled with Haredi, high-tech engineers, attorneys, accountants, doctors, and yes, even army generals. We are going to get there. And when that happens, Israel will be a completely different country. It'll be a country with much more harmony and unity and embracing when it comes to the religious issues as well. And that is the incredible time that we're looking forward towards. So right now, we are trying to lay the foundations for that. But as time goes along and the decades pass, with God's help, we will see an Israel where there's unity and where every single Jew can truly feel at home and that this is their country as well. So I thank all of you for joining for the first part, which is just a presentation. And I'm happy to be able to share with you some optimism and good news in a time where we're inundated with the opposite. And now, Rabbi Trop, I think we'll open up the floor to questions that anyone has, either about the topic that I talked about or anything else you want to ask about what's happening in Israel. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbi Lippman, for that wonderful and enlightening presentation. Gives us a lot to think about and also some to be optimistic about. So let's open it up to the floor. If anyone wants to ask a question, you could send it to the chat box, or if you want, you could just you could unmute yourself. But we like to try to see if we could take it one at a time, and Rabbi Posey and I will moderate this. So Ayala, looks like I think you might have unmuted yourself. You want to start us off?
I did. I first of all want to thank you, Rabbi Lippman. It was a very optimistic, feel-good talk. And I know that there are a lot of Haredim already in the army. I know that a lot of them are in the Air Force. They're teaching them how to work the technology. And they kept saying when I saw that what makes it so great is that they go out into the world and they have a job. They can go out and work. And that's amazing. And by the way, apropos what we have been seeing, I don't know if anyone noticed, there was the kvuah of the rabbi this past week, and there were a lot of people, and a lot of the secular people were all upset with the police why they didn't go in hard on the people. And they said, we have to understand. They were standing back. They said, we have to understand this is a very important man and they're doing the best they can, but they need to come out and be there for the rabbi. So there are, like you said, there are secular people who are, a lot of seculars in Israel who are seeing the light, but yet, unfortunately, there are those who don't. So
the project that you're talking about is called Shachar Kachol, where in the Air Force they combine. These are usually guys who are a little bit older, who are married, and it's a really beautiful project to see because they really combine together. And it's also fascinating because they're in the, do you know the beige Air Force uniforms? So it's really fascinating to see Hasidim in the uniforms that are really, really revered in Israel. So it's a beautiful project.
Right. So it what you said, everything you said is a feel-good talk.
I saw a question in the chat about what do the rabbis feel about what's going on. It's a great, great question. When I first started in the Knesset with the Yesh Atid party, I got a phone call from a rabbi, pretty well-known, pretty prominent rabbi in Israel. I wouldn't call him, if we had to give them the levels of major leagues, AAA, AA, single A, he's definitely in the AAA category, sort of second tier. And he asked to meet with me. And I said, sure, I'll come to your yeshiva and meet with you. He said, no. You're not coming to my yeshiva. I'm coming to meet you at your house at 12 a.m. A lot of late night meetings going on in my life. And he comes to my house and he sat right here. I'm sitting at my seat right next to me. And he says to me, keep doing what you're doing. And then he said, you're saving us from ourselves. That was the language that he used. And I asked him, why can't you go out publicly and say that? It would really help if you did that. He said, no, I can't do that. If I go out publicly, my son will be thrown out of yeshiva. My daughter won't be able to get married, but just quietly keep doing what you're doing. So the rabbis on a quiet level are very supportive of the changes. They know that the system cannot sustain itself. And they know that people are suffering. Most of the rabbis will tell the young men to go to work if they ask, should I go to work? And they are supportive of the idea of supporting their families. I would stand at the Knesset podium and just read sources from the Jewish texts. I would read the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, which says anyone who has Torah not combined together with work, it leads to sin. They're going to lose their work. I would just read it. I would read the Gemara in Kiddushin that says that a father is obligated to teach his son a trade. I would read the language of the Ketuvah, where the husband accepts upon himself to support his family. And it would make some of the Haredi MKs crazy as I did that. But my point was to show that we're not doing anything which was rebellious in nature. This is hand in hand consistent with what Torah Judaism has always been. So there's quiet support from the rabbinic leadership, but definitely not any kind of significant open support for it.
We had just another question about how COVID has impacted some of the discussions and the trends that you're seeing in this unique time period.
So it's very interesting. In the very beginning, when Corona hit Bnei Brak very hard in particular, there was an interesting development where the internet companies noticed a huge, huge increase in the number of homes in Bnei Brak that registered for internet, because people felt that they needed to have a source of information about what's going on because they weren't getting it from their within their communities. And that seemed to indicate a change towards let's hear what the government has to say and try to follow the policies. The biggest struggle with Corona has actually been regarding schools. The Haredi population obviously thrives off its kids going to schools. When the kids aren't in school, they have nothing to do with their time. They don't have any kind of a system for that. Again, we're talking about generally, this is a very broad generalization, but smaller apartments, larger families, that's one of the reasons why it spread so quickly in the community. It wasn't, as many people said, because they're all not keeping to the rules. It's just not true. It's just that even if you keep to the rules, if one person in the family gets the virus, it just will go to the entire family very quickly, and then you have an entire apartment building before you know it. But the issue of schools was their biggest challenge. This is a population which has school all year round. They only have off for the younger kids on Yom Kippur and on Tisha B'Av. Otherwise, they're in school. because that's sort of how they keep the children within the fold. So there's a fear of, yes, on the one hand, leaving school might lead to some physical dangers, but there were also a lot of tension about what will be with the spiritual dangers. There's a big, big debate in the community about this issue. Rabbi Bambach, who you saw in that video, has been out there saying, we're closing down the schools, we're following the health regulations, and there was some pushback from other populations as well. It's been a real challenge for the community. It has certainly added to tension in Israel between the Haredi population and outside the Haredi population, to the point that we now have elections, and one of the campaigns, Avigdor Lieberman's campaign for Yisrael Beitenu, there are billboards all over Israel which say, an end to the reign of the Haredim. Okay, literally saying we are going to stop them from dominating in our lives. That's not a positive campaign. That's not good for those who want to see unity in Israel, and it's a shame from my perspective that anybody, even if you want to make changes, there's a way that you can do it in a delicate and harmonious and loving type of way. But that's a symbol of the tension that's taking place because of what's happened with Corona.
Just one other question that also came out is, how is this different or impacting both Haredi men and Haredi women?
So what's interesting is that the system was sort of built to give Haredi women an education. So at the high school level, they would already have a general education, a basic general education. There already were college programs, and there already were companies that were hiring them. So employment for, when we started this, for Haredi women was in the high 70% range when we started. The men, it was way below 50%. One of the things that we've seen that has changed because we've started this program is that a lot of the Haredi women don't feel the same pressure that they had before. They still can work and pursue whatever career they want, but it's not that they have a pressure to take care of the entire family, and the hours that they work are able to be adjusted. That's been a very positive development. By the way, I wanted to mention one of the areas where we're finding tremendous success for the Haredim is in the area of high tech. Remember, these are young men that have been studying in yeshiva. They've been learning how to think. They understand critical thinking and how one thing leads to another. And the CEOs are saying that in high tech, they're doing incredible work. They're some of the most creative and disciplined employees that they have in their companies.
One other question I had is, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, on that last point, Rabbi Lippman, we actually had Eliezer Shkedi, who is the head of the Israeli Air Force and also CEO of El Al. He actually came to Bet Jacob and he described the fact how there was a program integrating the Haredim into the Air Force, and that he spoke to some of his friends in the Air Force and was speaking about the incredible work ethic of the Haredim, because they're used to 14, 16 hours a day focused on, and they're able to focus on, usually it's Torah, but here they were able to really be successful in high tech and also, in terms of relating it to the Air Force. I had a couple of just questions in terms of, let's say the Haredim who are entering the workforce, and that's, I think, a very, very encouraging development, and Haredim also who are more, are going to the army in greater frequency. But number one, in terms of are the kids who are studying general studies and going to the army, are these the ones who are maybe not successful? They're not able to be successful in the yeshivot. Are they perceived by the Haredim as the kids and the teens who are really not making it, or is it becoming a little more mainstream? That's my first question. And second question is the chilonim, and I don't like using that term chilonim, but it's hard to know how to describe, because as you said, right, even the secular Israeli, so to speak, is not that secular, but and every Jew is filled with tremendous kedusha and is movement in the right direction. But are they aware? Is the Chiloni or the Greater Israeli Society aware of these trends of Haredim entering the workforce and entering the army? And is there dialogue? I know it's a few different questions. Is there dialogue among Haredim and the greater Israeli community?
Great questions. So first of all, before I was involved in all of this, and probably just a new immigrant, not really understanding what was happening around me, most of these programs were just for Haredim who didn't make it. They were even on the fringe. There was a fear of them going off the path. So some kind of programs are put together for them. But since then, it has now become mainstream. It has now become established for the Haredim who are even, doing well in yeshiva, but I need to be able to support my family, and I have to find a way to do that. So that's been, and in the army also. Nahal Haredi, when it first started, was practically not religious. It was Haredim. People came from Haredi families, but they weren't strong Haredim at all. But now we're seeing in these other units that are developing real mainstream Haredim who have made a decision that they're going to be serving and learning a trade. So we've seen a really positive shift in terms of that. Sadly, Chiloni Israel is not so aware. Broader Israel is not so aware of what's happening. They see the same news footage as you see on a near daily basis. They see the Haredi members of Knesset who get up and very often speak against the secular community. And very sadly, we have not succeeded in a broader sense of getting that message. And that's why I say we're a few generations away from the numbers being strong enough that you'll see the change. Those who are in those companies, they see it. They can't believe it. Secular Israelis, they say, I can't believe my best friend is Yankel from Bnei Brak. I can't believe it. But they literally are forging friendships and relationships, and that's where the real change is taking place. But we haven't reached the critical mass yet where that message is really getting to broader Israel. But having said that, to your third point, there are many efforts to have discussions and groups that meet for Haredim and Chilonim to meet, to speak to one another. It's a little bit delicate. You have to arrange it. That we've had some speed dating events, so to speak, all men, all female, where they get to know each other and talk to each other. And there are various projects that are in place. There's an organization called Gesher, which is very involved in doing beautiful work on this front, and some other opportunities as well. The one thing which secular Israel, has seen is little by little, they're starting to get this message. They've seen Rabbi Bambach, everybody, he's been all over the news in Israel. They've seen Rabbi Yehuda Meshi Zahav, who's the head of Zaka, who's very much out there as someone who's very openly Haredi and yet very involved in the world out there. They've seen a very interesting cultural phenomenon. So, for example, there was a video that was put out with Avram Fried, a Haredi American, but singer, together with a top Israeli secular singer who has been very open about his questions about God and religion. And they put out a video together. People want this. People want to see unity. People want to get along with each other. So there needs to be a greater effort, though, to bring the information to broader Israel. That's for sure.
Okay, so if you take a look at the chat, there were a couple of, maybe we'll end off since we're already at the hour mark, but maybe we'll end off with these last two questions. You could address them briefly, Rabbi Littman, and really thank you so much for really, at this time of disconnection, at this tough time for all of us, it's so meaningful for us to connect to Medinat Yisrael, to hear about the Matzav, to hear about a lot of these encouraging developments that are really meaningful to us as a religious Zionist community. We care deeply about Torah. We kind of understand where, Haredi community and the Torah and the mitzvot and that angle, but of course, we feel a sense of responsibility to Am Yisrael, Medinat Yisrael, and so we're happy to hear some of these developments. And Yasher Koach to you. Yasher Koach to you. Thank you so much for all you're doing to help, move the needle in the right direction in all these issues, and for helping shape Israeli society. The couple of last questions is, maybe I'll just mention it quickly. I'll mention the two or three together and you could address them briefly, each of them. Not sure if there has been an off the derech situation among the Haredim. If so, have these changes that you described tonight, have that reduced that effect? How do the Haredim justify putting others in danger by not wearing masks and serving in the army? And then the last comment from Samuel, they are worried by losing some of their own, but how about influencing others? Okay, so I'm not sure exactly. They're worried about by losing some of their own. How about influence? In other words, how about bringing their Torah values to society? They should be maybe more concerned about of outreach and having a positive impact on others, as opposed to just being nervous about losing their own religiosity.
Absolutely. So I'll address some of those and bring this wonderful session to a close. So first of all, about off the derech, it's actually very high percentages in the Haredi community are leaving. Think about it we're leaving. Think about it for a moment. You're a young man. It's very unusual to find someone who really can sit and learn Torah day and night as their only pursuit. And if that's their only option, then they were leaving the community. And when they left the community, they were leaving very hard. They were falling to the worst levels of Israeli society. A lot of them were involved in drugs and on the streets. And one of the things that all these projects have provided is the ability for them to find some kind of balance. And we are starting to see the numbers decrease in terms of how many are going off. It used to be about 10% was estimated were leaving their families and falling away. And hopefully we're closing those numbers, because this is not an anti-Haredi agenda. This is a goal for them to continue being Haredi, but also support their families with dignity. So that's in terms of that, we're seeing a very positive development. In terms of how they justify it, I'll put the Haredi hat on for a moment. They say, the spiritual side, the studying of Torah, that is why Israel is being successful in the army. We are doing our part. If you go back historically, there was Shevet Levi, the tribe of Levi. There was always a group, even at times of King David, there was a group that studied Torah while others were serving in the front lines. So we're the ones who are fulfilling that. And by the way, I am not disagreeing with them that it's the spiritual element of Israel which drives God's blessings for everything that comes Israel's way. I just believe that we can have it as a rotation basis, just like the Hesder Yeshiva has it. And certainly, though, in a time of war, where our lives are in danger, everyone has to go out and work. But they really do feel that they are the ones who are providing that spiritual success. On the mask front, I will tell you that most of the Haredim that I see, I think it's the same exact percentage as the rest of the population that are not wearing masks. It's not a Haredi issue. It's just there are people out there that don't want to wear masks, and most of the population, thank God, they are wearing masks. So it is always important to understand where they're coming from, though, in terms of the population, and saying we are giving the spiritual energy to Israel. I want to close by saying, if we would have gone back 5 generations, and asked our great-great-great-grandparents, what do you think? Would you want to have a situation where you have a Jewish state of Israel, and your challenge is trying to figure out whether yeshiva boys should serve in a Jewish army defending the Jewish people or not? How do you balance together boys who are in yeshiva in the Holy Land with studying general studies? They would have said, you are making this up. There's no possibility of that being the scenario. And I would give up anything for that to be my challenge in life. Very often, we focus so much on the negative that's going on. And I'm not in any way sweeping away the challenges. I spend my day and night dealing with the challenges. But thank God, these are our challenges. We have a Jewish state. We have a Jewish army. We're developing a Jewish country. This is literally prophecies coming true before our eyes of the ingathering of the exiles and the reflourishing of Israel. So as we talk about the challenges, and as you, people who clearly love Israel, you're taking the time to be engaged about Israel, as you see what's happening in Israel, I'm asking all of you, yes, you can feel saddened and challenged and difficult sometimes about what's happening, but always take a step back and see the bigger picture and be filled with the greatest thanks to God that we can be living in this glorious time, and be optimistic about Israel's future, because where we are today compared to where we were 70 years ago, you can only imagine where we'll be 70 years from now. And with God's help, Israel will fill its place as the light unto the nations. And with God's help, we'll also experience the coming of the ultimate final redemption. And again, I thank all of you for joining us and for your support for Israel.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Rabbi Lippman, for getting us pumped. Your insights and energy are very uplifting. This was really, really great on multiple levels. And thank you so much, Rabbi Lippman, for joining us. And we wish you continued success in all the amazing work that you're doing. And this was a really fantastic group of members of the community, and really great group. And so thank you all for joining us. Hope you enjoyed the program.